Rachel Patterson is our Legislative and Climate Associate at Environmental Advocates, New York. Rachel manages the legislative tracking and memorandum process and distribution at EA. In her work on the climate team, she supports Electrify New York through managing our municipal work on transit electrification. Prior to this, she served as the Excelsior Fellow for New York State, working for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, and briefly for the Office of Governor Andrew Cuomo. I will hand it over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for everyone for coming tonight and for bearing with us. And I will just give a preview that I live across the street from a fire station, so you might hear some noise. So today I will be walking you through how municipalities can transition to electric vehicle fleets. Can you go to the next slide, please? So as Josh mentioned previously, EANY is part of a statewide coalition, Electrify New York, which has the goals of environmental justice, public transportation, social justice, fighting for clean jobs, and equitable transportation. Our main goals are to electrify all public transportation fleets by 2040, as well as have accompanying policies and resources to assist in the transition of those fleets and have municipalities leading the way. Next slide, please. So just to give a little background on the state context, roughly a year ago, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was passed, which was some groundbreaking legislation that established aggressive, legally binding targets to transition New York's economy off of fossil fuels by the year 2050. Now, this will have significant implications for every sector and hopefully will spur innovation and create jobs. But in order to get from where we are today to the 2050 goal, there needs to be a new framework for emissions reductions, and this law has accompanying action plans as well as a blueprint for equitable transition for all sectors in the economy. Next slide, please. So transforming transportation in New York State is a bit tricky because transportation represents the largest share of the state's greenhouse gas emissions, roughly 36%. And there are 11 million cars and light-duty trucks registered within the state, but less than 60,000 of those are electric vehicles. New York State follows California's zero-emissions vehicle mandate, which means that we've committed to a goal of 850,000 zero-emission vehicles by 2050. And as you can see, that's quite a large gap. So transitioning from internal combustion engines to this electric transportation system is going to take careful planning and preparation on the part of the state and also on local governments. Next slide, please. But we do believe that local governments can lead the way in this transition. Aside from the health and environmental benefits that come with reductions in air pollution, the communities will also receive significant economic benefits to households, businesses, and governments through reductions in energy costs. And local governments are well positioned to lead the charge on electric vehicles and help propel the state to a clean transportation future. All across the country, we have seen municipalities leading the way, and we believe that it's time for New York to do the same. Next slide, please. Which is why the Electrify NY Coalition has created and recently updated a municipal toolkit, which can be found on the Electrify NY website. So I will spend the next few slides walking you through some of the newer parts of the toolkit as well as some of the fundamentals. Next slide, please. So the first step to transition a municipality to electric vehicles is to create a clean fleet commitment. And this happens through local laws that mandate the development of a comprehensive plan that includes assessment of existing fleets, EV procurement schedules, and special considerations for heavy-duty vehicles as well as emergency vehicles, and in addition, infrastructure and maintenance investments that will allow for a full-scale transition. And now a public mandate is not the only way to begin this transition, but by codifying it in local law, it allows the public to be engaged in the process of transitioning to electric fleets, and it allows accountability for the public to understand what the goals are. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that municipalities can get engaged and have affordable options for electric vehicles is through aggregate purchasing and shared services. The New York State Office of General Services has an aggregate purchasing service, which allows municipalities to bid on electric vehicles that are lower rates. Cities can also join the Climate Mayor's Electric Vehicle Purchasing Collaborative, which uses joint purchases to lower the costs of electric vehicles. Next slide, please. So one of the bigger areas of concern that many municipalities have as far as it relates to electric vehicle transition is heavy-duty vehicles. And just this year, the governor signed an MOU with 14 other states and the District of Columbia that pledges to develop an action plan to increase electrification of buses and heavy-duty trucks. And this multi-state effort is going to accelerate the market for electric medium and heavy-duty fleet vehicles, which is quite exciting. Municipalities can take an active step in beginning to ramp up medium and heavy-duty vehicles through partnerships with utility companies that help provide infrastructure, which will limit range issues and concerns, which tend to be a much bigger problem with heavy-duty vehicles respective to traditional ones. Next slide, please. So many cities have been taking the opportunity to electrify school buses, which is a great option. Electrification of buses improves the air quality for residents along the route as well as for the children who ride the bus. And in addition to that, electrifying school buses can provide a benefit because when the school buses aren't being used on weekends and during the summertime, they can be hooked up to the grid and serve as backup battery storage. Next slide, please. So beyond public transit systems, municipalities also have power to influence the emissions within their district by looking into things such as car share and ride share programs. Car share programs such as Uber and Lyft and ride share programs like Zipcar can have a relatively large environmental toll and have been used much more recently. So municipalities can require car share programs within their districts to have electrification plans. Lyft, by the way, has committed to 100% electrification by the year 2030. So creating special contracts with this organization would benefit the overall emissions reduction of your district. And municipalities can work with car share companies in partnership with utilities to create charging hubs in high traffic areas such as airports, which can encourage EV use for traditional users as well. Next slide, please. So EV charging infrastructure is a necessary component and can be somewhat of a hurdle for customers that don't have access. So the key to a successful transition is to create a network of robust charging infrastructure that's visible and public. Accessible charging points increase customer confidence in the reliability of electric vehicles. And these publicly available stations offer alternatives because there are a lot of people that don't have the ability to charge at home, whether they live in an apartment complex or otherwise. And local governments can take a lead role in promoting EV infrastructure through these public investments, which again show commitment to the community, as well as through regulations such as parking ordinances, streamlined permitting, utility partnerships, and public access initiatives. Next slide. So EV parking can also be a very transparent way to encourage EV ownership. Municipalities can require parking facilities to designate a certain amount of spaces for EV parking and EV parking only, and parking authorities can enforce rules that discourage the use of EV parking stalls by drivers of gasoline or diesel vehicles. And in addition to that, we've seen that some cities even go far enough to offer free or discounted parking for electric vehicles. Next slide, please. So the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, can serve as a great resource to municipalities when they're planning to make the transition to electric vehicles, and they have a best practice guide that municipalities can look into for charging stations, which is accessible on their website. Next slide, please. Municipalities can also play an active role in preparing to be EV ready through the adoption of electric vehicle ready building codes through local building codes, and requiring all new construction to be EV ready. We've seen examples of this, for example, in the city of Atlanta, and these sample ordinances will be available in the toolkit online. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, public access to charging infrastructure is critical, particularly for EV owners that wouldn't have the ability to charge at home, as well as publicly accessible electric vehicles does show the commitment that municipalities have to transitioning to electric fleets, and can encourage people that don't already have electric vehicles to be interested in acquiring one. The municipalities, oh, go ahead, it's fine. So another area that municipalities can get engaged in with electric vehicles is through utility partnerships. By partnering with utilities, municipalities can expand the infrastructure that they have for electric vehicle charging. And in certain situations, they can even work with low-income community members so that the municipality itself will install the charger and maintain it and pay for the upfront and long-term costs, which we have seen successfully done in cities like San Diego. Next slide, please. Education and awareness is also a critical component of making the transition to electric vehicles. As stated previously, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is going to impact every sector of New York State, and it is going to require participation from every citizen. And municipalities can serve as a hub for electric vehicle related information on tax credits and funds available to individuals. And partnering with community-based organizations to sponsor outreach events such as drive programs or promotional events or promoting on social media can help people become more comfortable with the concept of electric vehicles. Outreach events can also specifically target low-income community members who we, of course, will need to bring along on the transition to electric vehicles. Next slide, please. So the big question that everyone worries about is how to pay for it. So municipalities can learn about how to finance EV infrastructure first through their local regional planning commissions and local economic development boards, but there are also a number of state agencies such as NYSERDA, the New York Power Authority, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and as well as the US Department of Energy that all have programs and incentives for both municipalities and individuals to be able to uptake electric vehicles. And that concludes my presentation today, but you can go on the Electrify NY site to read all of the new features of the updated toolkit. And if you have any questions, you can always feel free to contact me at the email provided.
Thank you, Rachel. We have time for a couple of questions for Rachel, and we're also joined by Connor Bambrick, our Director of Climate Policy, who may join in on the Q&A as well. If you have questions for either of them, please feel free to type it into the chat box, or if you want to raise your hand, we can call on you as well.
I have a question.
Yes, Alex.
I was wondering if mentioned NYSERDA, NYPA, DEC, and the U.S. Energy Department all have incentive programs for electrification. I was just wondering if under the current presidential administration, if any of those incentive programs have taken a hit at the federal level.
I tend not to work as much on federal policy as state policy, so I wouldn't be able to fully answer that, but an assumption would say they likely have. But I do know that the federal programs continue to be funded, so that's positive. I see a question that says, how easy is it to get funding? With COVID-19, there's a great economic stress right now on cities. Yes, and that's very true. And we have, from our surveys of local community members and elected officials, we have heard that that is the biggest pushback. So yes, there is a legitimate decrease in funding right now. However, that doesn't mean that municipalities can't continue to plan. For example, the city of Albany is taking this time with limited funding to be able to plan a more robust electric vehicle transition plan. So yeah, I'm not sure how to.
And I know Tara has asked if we could have the second to last slide on the screen again as well. Okay. We probably have time for one more question before we head back to Jacob.
I did see a question from Michael Bailey. Are steps being taken to increase support from car dealers to encourage EV sales? And Rachel or Connor, do you want to take that one?
So this is part of the toolkit, is that municipalities absolutely can work with car dealerships. I don't know of any policies that mandate that. However, that is always an option. And we do know that most car dealerships now, all the large traditional ones, are actively working to develop electric vehicles.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm so sorry to be a big mouth.
No worries.
I live in a suburb of Long Island, and there are a lot of, it's a crazy quilt of overlapping jurisdictions. I'm in a village, which is in a town, which is in a county, and just in doing advocacy work, I wouldn't know who to advocate to do some of these things like the parking spaces or the EV stations. Is there a simple way to know? I realize there might not be a simple answer to this question, but is there a way to know or to learn who has jurisdiction over what, and who is the person, which government entity is the one to complain to or to advocate to?
That's a great question, and a bit of a tricky one. The reason that, you know, we say municipality instead of city, town, or village is because there are so many differentiations. I would say advocate to all of them personally. It couldn't hurt, it doesn't hurt. We advocate to the city of Albany, you know, on behalf of people, to the city of Albany, as well as to Albany County. They both have, you know, slightly different initiatives. So I'm sorry I don't have a streamlined answer for that, but I think attacking it from all angles is the best way to get it done.
Yeah, this is Connor. I think that's exactly right, Rachel. And in fact, our experience through Electrify, we have done work down on Long Island, and I'm not exactly sure where you are, but a good example is you know, our work with both Nassau County and the Lower Kern, the county executive, and also the town of Hempstead.
And in session 2 of this forum on August 6th, we're also going to be digging into some of the sort of more specific steps on how to push these at the local level. So that might be useful to listen into that session as well. We'll go into a little bit more detail on that front. All right, I'm going to pause this Q&A and hand it back to Jacob. And then if we have time at the end, we can continue more general questions for Rachel or Connor as well.
Can everyone hear me now?
You sound
That's
good.
better.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going through my phone and I'm muted on the computer. So hopefully this works a little better. Okay, so start from the beginning, or what's, where do we, I think I left off kind of on my slide outlining EV registrations in New York State. I think for the sake of time, it's probably the better start there anyway. So the next slide. Okay, so really just to kind of reiterate what I was getting at before. Those 2016 numbers is just kind of what we were looking at as a baseline, since that was when we had done our original plan. Overall, so this is looking at electric vehicle registrations in the state of New York. We've seen significant growth since 2012. Currently, there's over 52,000 registered electric vehicles in the state of New York, and approximately 44% are full battery electric vehicles, and 56% are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Overall, though, still less than 1% of all light-duty electric vehicle fleet is electric. So still a ways to go to kind of meet those the numbers that we want to get to help push us towards that Climate Leadership Community Protection Act that Rachel was just talking about. But nevertheless, still seeing good movement statewide. So if we go to the next slide, it will be the similar graph, just looking at the Capital District. So see a pretty similar trend line. Just over 3,500 electric vehicles in the Capital District. A slightly different breakdown, a little less overall battery electric vehicles, around 35% and 65% plug-in hybrid electric. So different to the statewide numbers in that way. But if we look at that just over 800 registered electric vehicles in 2016, that's growth of over 300% in just about 4 years. So really kind of seeing that electric vehicle landscape pick up steam in the past few years. And so this data, the 2020 data, is as of July 2nd, which was the last DMV snapshot. And just so you all know, this is it's New York State Department of Motor Vehicle registration data, and I accessed this through NYSERDA's Evaluate New York data tool, which is publicly accessible. So this is data that any one of you can pull up at any time to kind of track the growth of electric vehicles, which is a great tool that's out there. Next slide. So similar to electric vehicle registrations, we also see a similar increase in the available charging outlets in the Capital District. So this is a graph of the public level 2 outlets, and this data is as of yesterday when I pulled it. This data source is a U.S. Department of Energy tool that's also publicly available online. The Alternative Fuels Data Center, Alternative Fuel Station Locators. So again, a quick Google search, and anybody can look up this and download the data in CSV and manipulate it how they want. So again, a very good tool. So right now we're about 660 public level 2 charging stations in the Capital District, similar to that 300% growth rate since 2016. So again, we're seeing great growth and installations of additional electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and more importantly, as I mentioned originally, there was no DC fast charging in the region in 2016. We have close to 50 DC fast charging outlets today. And again, this is kind of those DC fast charging outlets is kind of what we're looking at now as what's going to facilitate that interregional travel with electric vehicles and allow people to kind of operate them more comfortably like a gasoline vehicle, where they may be making a trip across the state or throughout the region or across regions. So that DC fast charge infrastructure number is really important to look at as well. Next slide, please. So in our plan that we put out last year, we kind of talked about ZEV readiness, so zero emission vehicle readiness or electric vehicle readiness. Just looking at the registration and station installation data, it looks like EVs are on the up, which is great. So we kind of took a look at, why, what are some of the policies and things that might be unique to the Capital District that's helping push the adoption of electric vehicles, and what might continue to help push that adoption into the future. And a few of these Rachel just mentioned in her presentation, which is great. So obviously, throughout the state, there's multiple incentive programs for new electric vehicles and the charging infrastructure that the consumer can take advantage of, municipalities can take advantage of, private organizations can take advantage of, which we feel is obviously helping offset that cost of the vehicles and the charging infrastructure. The Charge New York Drive Clean rebate, Charge Ready New York for the infrastructure, as well as the New York State Truck Voucher Incentive Program, which offers incentives for the incremental cost of heavy-duty vehicles, not just electric vehicles, but also other alternative fuels. So really a lot of great options out there to help offset the cost of electric vehicles. Again, the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act was going to go a little bit more into this, but I think Rachel covered it very well. Really, we see that as, kind of that commitment from New York State that, cleaner, greener energy is a priority, and that that's going to help push the adoption of electric vehicles into the future. So, that's really a key point that's going to allow for the future adoption of electric vehicles. The commute distances in the Capital District, something that we highlight in the report that kind of thinks pretty unique. By taking a look at National Household Travel Survey data and data from the American Community Survey, we looked at average travel times in the region. So the average commute one way to work is about 26 minutes, and the average travel distance is about 11 miles one way. So that's just a two-work trip. So if we want to say round trip, 22 miles to work and back, obviously, pretty high level, scenario planning here, but, just say a 22-mile round trip to work and back, not counting any secondary trips. Of the electric vehicles on the market today, there's 53 that have a 22-mile or greater all electric range. So that's about 70% of electric vehicles available today that could get most residents of the Capital District their daily commute without the use of gasoline. So I think that's pretty important to note, that I think a lot of times we think that electric vehicle technology maybe isn't where, isn't up to snuff, or it's still evolving, which it definitely is, but really the technology that's out there today can get most people by without the use of gasoline, which is kind of a great point to make and to continue to remind people of when we talk about it. Next slide, please. So electric vehicle barriers and opportunities. Again, I think a lot of these were talked about in the last presentation, which is great. Some of the barriers that we see, one of the big ones is electricity demand charges. So these are additional fees, that are assessed to a customer kind of based on their peak monthly usage rather than kind of the average use. So this is really key in the installation of that DC fast charging, and a real deterrent of potential hosts to install. So what it leads to is kind of unpredictable and high additional electricity fees, which kind of takes the business case out of installing DC fast charger for a lot of private entities. In our talks with others and hosts and utilities, this is a problem that everyone is aware of, but I don't necessarily know if there's any solutions at this point, none that I've heard at least. So that's definitely something that we want to keep an eye on, and will probably continue to be play into the role of EV adoption into the future. access to at-home charging of electric vehicles. A lot of that comes down to folks that are living in multi-unit dwellings or in urban areas where you might not have the access to either the infrastructure or you don't have the ability to kind of install the infrastructure yourself. So that at-home charging kind of forces you to rely on public infrastructure that might be around you to make the switch to an all-electric vehicle, or you know, potentially if you had at-work charging, that could help you make the switch too. But you know, we see that as a big deterrent to a lot of that population that aren't single-family homeowners that have the ability to kind of put a level 2 station in their garage and kind of always allow them to have that max capacity, which would take away a lot of the range anxiety for people looking to make the switch. Electric vehicle pricing. Again, this is still something that when we talk to folks, whether it's perceived or real, the price of electric vehicles is definitely a deterrent. And but although the prices are coming down and kind of with rebates and incentives, kind of pushing closer towards those internal combustion engine vehicle counterparts, it's something that is still going to be a factor in, you know, people not choosing an EV. So really, I think with that is continuing to promote and make people aware of the incentives that are available, and getting them to ask questions when going to the dealership, you know, by, you know, not necessarily just looking at the sticker price of the vehicle and asking questions to see what they would really be paying once all the incentives and credits are added on there. Opportunities we see, which kind of tie into the rest of this presentation, what we heard before, the municipal EV readiness policy. If a municipality can begin to you know, put into their zoning and parking policy and codes and new development codes that electric vehicles are a priority, this can drastically reduce the cost of installing EV infrastructure down the road, if it's you know, if that's the way that a developer would like to go. So I think continuing to have presentations like this and outreach and education events to local planning and policy boards, and you know, municipal employees as well, that's going to be a great opportunity. And once folks, and also adopting their municipal fleet to transition to electric vehicles as well. And once folks, residents of that municipality see that, maybe more apt for them to kind of make that switch as well. And then really just general education and outreach. A lot of times, you know, purchasing an electric vehicle, unless you've done the research yourself, you know, as a consumer going into the dealership, you might not hear the benefits. If you're just going in there, walking in saying, I want a new vehicle, you really need to take it upon yourself to do that research on electric vehicles. So the more that organizations like Clean Communities and EA New York can kind of do events like this and webinars that are really showing people and educating them what's available for electric vehicles, it's going to help push us toward EV adoption. So what's next? Actually, our organization, Capital District Clean Communities, is going to be hosting a municipal EV readiness workshop. Hopefully, you're going to finalize that date by the end of this week, looking for the end of September. And I'm going to have speakers from electric vehicle or EVSE charging stations manufacturers, as well as some speakers from local municipalities that have recently taken advantage of a lot of these incentives and implemented some EV readiness policy themselves. So you get to hear firsthand from them, and as well as kind of go through some of the tools that municipalities have to implement EV readiness, like zoning and parking and all of those policies. So what's next for us on that line? That's what we're up to. and be happy to pass that information along to anybody that's interested, and certainly pass it along to the folks at EA New York and have them push it out to their contact list as well. So that's it for me. Also, emails on there if anybody has any other questions on that workshop or any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Jacob. We do have several great questions in the chat. I am thinking just in terms of the time we have left that maybe we should save those to the end for a Q&A after our next speaker. And then we can try to get to some of those. And if we can't answer all of our questions on this session, then we can follow up by email if our speakers will help us answer those questions offline. So thank you, Jacob. I would now like to introduce Daniel Kirk-Davidoff. As a climate and weather scientist, Daniel works on forecasting solar and wind generation for electrical grid operators at UL LLC. He's also an adjunct associate professor of atmospheric science at the University of Maryland and a member of the City of Albany's Sustainability Advisory Committee. So I will hand it over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks to whoever fancied up the font on my slide. That looks really good. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I want to just talk a little bit about the scope of what we need to do over the next few years to keep in compliance with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So that act states that we're supposed to have targets of expressed as a fraction of emissions that were emitted in New York State in 1990. So in this chart from NYSERDA, you can see that we've already gone down a little bit from 1990. We were at 236 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent back then. Now we're at 205. That difference is, I think, mostly due to elimination of coal from our electrical grid and reduction of electrical and commercial, industrial and commercial energy uses, some through efficiency and some just through changes in our economy. Next slide. So to get down from 1990 targets, that means the reductions from today's are a little bit smaller than they would be if the goals were expressed in terms of today's emissions. And I'll get to that in the next slide. But right now, I just wanted to take a quick look at this. And you can see that besides the total emissions of CO2 are very heavily in the transportation sector. So burning gas and diesel fuel in cars and trucks is like 40-odd% of our total, 43% of our total CO2 emissions. The very small little bar for electricity is mostly mass transit. Although, presumably that also includes a few, the electric cars that are on the road right now. And then commercial and residential do a bunch of on-site CO2 emissions, but a big chunk of those is electric. Now, as I'm going to discuss in a moment, moving forward, there are explicit targets for electricity decarbonization. So in some sense, we can think of that as taken care of, and then the rest, in order to meet the overall targets for CO2 emissions, we have to figure out how to reduce the total amount of combustion in sectors besides electricity. Okay, next slide. Right, so scaling the requirements under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act scaled to today's number, that we need a 31% reduction from today's emissions of CO2 equivalent by 2030, and a 77% reduction from today's emissions by 2050, and we're supposed to have zero carbon electricity by 2040. So to think about, what we need to get out of the rest of the economy, maybe we should think about, well, what's the approximate target for the overall reduction by 2040, by which time we're anticipating we'll have zero carbon electricity. So just, kind of interpolating between 2030 and 2050 goals, we have to have a 55% reduction of today's non-electricity usage by 2040. And that could involve an increased electrical usage, but the idea is that we might be making more electricity in 2040, but it will all be from non-CO2 emitting sources. Okay, so just the act of reducing the electricity emissions reduces our emissions by 15%. So that means we still have 40% of our present emissions that we need to get rid of by 2040. So if, clearly we're going to have to apply that to transportation, one could argue that you should apply a larger reduction than that to transportation, because transportation's turnover is faster than our built environment. We've already done, we've done some work in improving efficiency on our homes already. So a lot of what is going to happen in the future in order to reduce CO2 emissions from homes and offices is going to involve conversion of heating systems from natural gas and oil to electricity. And those are pretty big jobs. And they have the heat furnaces have pretty long lifetimes. So it's unlikely that we're going to get more than 40%. We're unlikely to get more than the proportional share of emissions out of those sectors. So we certainly need to at least reduce transportation emissions by 40%. Okay, next slide. So let's get a little ambitious and say we need a 50% reduction in transportation emissions. So we have a little bit of slack for the built environment. So there are 4.7 million vehicles on the road in the US, and they turn over every 10 to 20 years. The average car on the road is about 12 years old. So if about half of all new vehicles sold in New York starting now were electric vehicles. In that sense, just if we only think about the energy that they use on the road, we'd have achieved our 50% reduction by around 2040. On the other hand, if we wait a long time before we start really ramping up the electric vehicle sales, it would have to be like all cars sold in New York would have to be electric starting in, say, 2030 in order to get half of them to be fully electric by 2040. By that time. So I think we should really think about about the scale of that problem, right? So I live in Center Square in downtown Albany, and no one here has driveways, or very, not too many people. So essentially, we need, every car on the road to be able to plug in overnight, right? If we want them to travel emissions free the next day, and we probably want to be thinking about what's a minimal infrastructure cost that we need to pay in order to achieve that goal. So, there are a lot of these we're working now on these fast chargers that have the advantage of, allowing people to take a long trip at the spur of the moment. And I think that's great in terms of uptake. But we also want to think about just regular people driving to work, coming back at night, needing to plug their car in. And we might want to think about much simpler solutions, just putting an outlet, a plain outlet on every street light downtown. If we're concerned about people just, getting electricity for free, which we probably shouldn't be, we should probably just let them plug their cars in. But if we want to monitor it, there's much lower capital solutions that involve having a little device that plugs into the street lamp, and then it plugs into your electric car, just has a trickle overnight, but it connects through the cellular network, and you get billed for the electricity you use. But we want to be thinking creatively about cheap solutions, because we need to get a lot of vehicles on the road. The charts we saw earlier show that we're getting about 500 vehicles a year, 500 new electrical vehicles on the road every year. But the Capital District has about 1 million people, so probably about 1 million cars. And if we're going to turn over half of them in the next 20 years or so, what is that? 1 million cars divided by 20 years, that's like 50,000 cars a year. And right now we're doing, 500 a year. So that means we have to increase the rate of vehicle sales by a factor of, sounds like 100 to me. So that's a lot. And we have to be thinking about scale and about how to make that happen. I've been seeing the conversation in the chat about tax incentives and that kind of thing. But if we're going to get to the very high penetrations we need, we probably want to be thinking about basically saying that the only cars available to purchase in 10 years or so are electric cars, and everything else has to be off the road. We also want to be thinking, and I'm going to say one more thing and then I'm going to stop because I've used up almost all my time. We want to be thinking one more, we want to take one other thing into consideration, which is that electrical vehicles, like all vehicles, take a lot of energy to make. And you know, if they're not being constructed in New York State, maybe we don't have to think about that in the legal terms of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, but we probably ought to think about it in terms of overall policy for climate. And what that might mean is that, you know, backloading, well, what it definitely means is that we want to encourage as many people as possible to think about using cars as little as possible and getting by with as few cars as we can. So we might want to think about having smaller, cheaper electric vehicles like scooters and such, or even just smaller, cheaper electric cars that don't have very much range and are used mostly for commuting. And then, you know, you want to go up to the Adirondacks for the weekend, you rent a car, or, you know, use a car from a car sharing place. So we don't have huge hulking batteries that can go for 300 miles sitting around not being used. We want to keep those big batteries, which have a lot of embodied energy in them. You know, they require cobalt mining, they require lots of energy to be used. Hopefully all of that is clean energy in 10 or 15 years, but not necessarily. So we want to think about how we can share expensive things like big batteries and not just have them sitting around on the side of the road not doing anything. Okay. That's all I got. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you to all of our speakers. I know there are several questions here in the chat, which I'm not certain we have time for, unfortunately. I know there is, related to your presentation, Daniel, just now, an idea about pushing to require drive-in fast food restaurants to have charging stations in their parking lots. Ron had some options laid out in terms of overnight at home charging. New York City obviously is a testing neighborhood charging for options, testing neighborhood for charging options, and then workplace, schools, and fast chargers. So I'm going to propose that we send some of these questions to our speakers, and then we can send around some of the answers if folks are comfortable with that, because I know that we are at the hour. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We look forward to continuing this work together with all of our speakers in this forum and others on this call to help us transition our transportation system in the Capital District to an electric future fueled by clean, green energy. As I mentioned earlier, we have another session coming up on Thursday, August 6th from 12 to 1 p.m. So that's in the middle of the day. This event specifically will be action-oriented, featuring municipal and county officials and community leaders, and cover successful implementation of municipal electrification programs, the challenges going forward, and the most important next steps in electrifying our communities. And that one is also focused on the Capital District. So I hope to see some or all of you at that. Please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. Feel free to send them to Amanda, and we will compile questions and answers and send out additional resources, including the link to our toolkit if we have not done so already. So thank you so much to all of our speakers and everyone for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, guys.
Bye, everyone.
We'll make sure to answer all your questions. Thank you.
Bye-bye.